We're getting close. It's now spinning, setting up your webinar for Facebook Live.
Awesome.
So status bar, cue thriller music. Done redirecting to Facebook Live. And it looks like we're good.
Awesome.
Right.
I see it. I see it on Facebook.
Ooh. I do not.
All right.
Not seeing it on. Oh, there it is. Yay. Okay, great.
All right. See you on the other side.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, John.
You bet.
Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Skeleton Hour. This is a monthly horror literature webinar series of the Horror Writers Association, produced in collaboration with the Last Bookstore in downtown Los Angeles. So excited to have you all watching tonight and have such an amazing group of panelists here. Our topic for the night is witchcraft, and we have with us authors who've written both fiction and nonfiction about the topic. And if you have any questions for them throughout the chat, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box, and we'll be reading those off either throughout or at the end. And I'm also going to be posting in the chat links to purchase books by our authors tonight. So please, please, please buy them through either the Last Bookstore or a local indie bookseller near you and support our authors. We'd really appreciate that. And I think that's it. Without further ado, I'm going to hand things off to Lisa Quigley, who is the author of Hell's Bells, which is an amazing novella, and she is going to be moderating the discussion tonight. So take it away, Lisa.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here tonight. I think this is going to be a really great discussion. So really, to get us started, I would love to have our panelists introduce themselves, and I'm going to go off of the order I'm seeing. So I'll start with Gwendolyn. So if you could introduce yourself and then say maybe your most recent book or a book you would like to promote tonight, just a little bit about you.
All right. I think I'm first on your screen because it was like exactly 9:45 and I like got in right away. I'm like, I need to make sure because I'm in like this rural connection. So if I suddenly drop out, I'll be back. But I am Gwendolyn Kiste, and I'm the author of The Rust Maidens. And I'm also the author of Boneset and Feathers. That's my newest book, which is all about witchcraft. And I love witchcraft and I love witches. So I'm just super excited to be here and be talking about it tonight.
Awesome. And then Pam.
Hey everybody, I'm Pam Grossman. I'm the author of Waking the Witch, Reflections on Women, Magic, and Power, which is a nonfiction book about the archetype of the witch. And I'm the host of the Witch Wave podcast and a practicing witch as well.
Awesome, thank you. And Alexis.
Hi, I'm Alexis. I'm the author of The Year of the Witching, which is my very first novel. I basically like writing about dark, spooky horror things, but right now witchcraft is like my main fascination. And I'm super excited to be here tonight, hang out with you guys.
Awesome. And Zoraida. Oh, you're muted.
Hi, I'm muted. That's my name on every panel. Hi, I'm Zoraida Cordova. I'm the author of the Brooklyn Brujas series, which is a trilogy of companion novels set around three sisters who are they're witches and they're living in Brooklyn. And Bruja is just the Spanish word for witch. One of my most recent books is an anthology called Vampires Never Get Old, which features vampires and has a couple witches in there too. But yeah, those are my books.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for introducing yourselves. So we'll go ahead and get started. I myself personally identify as a witch, and I have a deeply personal magical practice. But I know that word means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So to kick us off, I would love to know, what is your personal relationship to the word witch? And I'll start with Alexis.
So this has always been like a big, and I think a little bit of an intimidating question for me, because my process, or I guess you could say my spiritual journey, and sort of my relationship with witchcraft as a practice sort of evolved as I was writing and researching The Year of the Witching. So the two very much came to be hand in hand. And I had I'd always had a fascination with witches and witchcraft and kind of darker things. But I grew up in a really conservative culture. I was homeschooled from first grade all the way to high school.
Me too.
Oh, really? I think there's so many homeschoolers who end up being like witchy or witches as they get
We're
older.
just,
I don't
like,
think it's
all the way on the other side.
right, because it creates this sort of like, I don't know, when something is so forbidden, I think that
Uh-huh.
it creates this even more fascination than what would already be there. So yeah, a lot of the witches that I know had really conservative, really religious backgrounds, and I was I certainly fall in that category. So yeah, my relationship to the word, I think, is constantly changing as I grow older and kind of grow up and learn more about the practice and sort of where I fall on that spectrum. But I think it's really interesting how the process of writing and researching and kind of allowing myself to to express my feelings and my practice even creatively has sort of helped me connect to deeper parts of myself and my own beliefs. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Awesome. And Zoraida, if you'd like to go.
Yeah, so I have had a very long relationship with the word witch and witchcraft since I was 10 years old. I'm from Ecuador. We immigrated to New York when I was 5 or 6. When I was 10, I have a journal covered in Spice Girl stickers that says, "Dear Diary, I'm changing my religion from Catholicism to Wicca, but I can't tell my mom." And so this was, this is like baby Zoraida that I didn't really identify with like the church that we went to. And after a while, my mom worked just so much, and she like went to school at night to learn English and get a degree, and then worked during the day. And so we just didn't have time to go to church. And so like I decided that I was a witch because I had discovered vampire books, witch TV shows, and I started with reading the Llewellyn Silver Ravenwolf teen books,
Yeah.
right? Like the teen witch books. And I was like, yeah. But then as I got older, I started thinking about what witchcraft actually means to me as a Latinx woman, right? Like our practice, I grew up seeing my grandmother use certain kinds of teas, and my mom puts very specific, like say things to like her saint candles that are not very Catholic. So witchcraft, and like in Latin America, witchcraft and Catholicism just go so hand in hand because of the indigenous practices and the slaves that were in Ecuador that they were converted, but they still kept their parts of their religion. And so you see that sort of trickle in, like with these, specifically in different Latin American countries. And in Ecuador, like witchcraft is so involved in everyday things that I never really thought to say like, oh, that's witchcraft. And now that I'm older, I see that yes, that's what it is. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's when I started writing the Brooklyn Brujas series and my first book, Labyrinth Lost. And I was just like, how do I write Charmed except make them Latin and in New York? And now they have the Latin charm, but it's not really Latin because they still use Celtic magic and Celtic symbols. So to me, it's still not the same thing. But anyway, long story, that's my relationship to
that. Gwendolyn?
I've always loved the word witch. I've always loved it, and I've always kind of more or less embraced it because it's something that I think has been maligned, and it's something that it's been viewed as being so negative and being this terrible thing. And it always felt to me like the witches were really not being treated very well, from fairy tales to films to everything else. So it was like, as I grew up, I'm like, I feel like I'm way more connected to the witches than to any of the people that are supposed to be, the good guys, the good characters in like fairy tales, who always seem so boring. The good characters in like a fairy tale were always boring. The witches always seem to be having more fun until somebody decided that, we're going to push them in an oven or set them on fire. So I've always very much embraced witch. I'm also, as I think all of us actually are, a practicing witch. So it's something that, trying to always integrate it into my daily practice and my daily life in different ways. So yeah, I love the word witch. I love that so many people are reclaiming it, and that it's something that so many of us are proud of now, because I feel like even 10 years ago, there wasn't as much conversation about it, even on social media. And to see it now, I know some people, and it can get co-opted, obviously, for commercialism. That's of course a thing that can happen. But I also do like that so many people are embracing it, because I think it also embraces the feminine, and it embraces so much of who we are in our history, because every culture has witchcraft, every culture has folk magic. And it's interesting to me how much even people who are like, oh, witchcraft, that's scary, a lot of them will have like folk magic and practices that they do, and superstitions, and like you were saying, like special teas and things like that. That's something that so many people share. Even people are like, oh, witches. It's like, you're kind of a witch too, you just don't know it. So that's definitely, I feel like there is like, isn't it from Practical Magic, there's a little witch in every woman or something, and I feel like there's a little witch in every person. So I mean, like in general, I feel like we're all coming from witchcraft. So yeah, I love it.
And Pam?
Yeah, I love the word witch too. And it's definitely a word that I've evolved along with. When I was a kid, I certainly did my own little spells, and I loved mythology and magic and fairy tales. I started experimenting with spell books when I was probably a preteen in suburban New Jersey, magical suburban New Jersey. And my grandmother was a librarian, so I was always hanging out in the low end of the Dewey Decimal System, where all the cool shit is. You all know what I'm talking about. So I was playing with magic and spellcraft and lighting candles and all of that. And then I started studying magic and the occult and creativity, through many different college courses, and realized that so many creative people have gravitated towards magic. That, yes, it's certainly a practice of healing and ritual, but it's also a deeply creative practice that many artists and musicians and, writers have used or embodied as well. And that really resonates with me as a creative person. And then once I got into my 20s, I secretly thought of myself as a witch, but I started being much more public about it and really deepened my practice and found a wonderful teacher and a coven. And then, I'm now approaching middle age in a couple months. I'm going to turn 40 in February. And so it's been really amazing to embrace the identity of the witch and to embody this archetype, because it speaks to a history of the oppression of marginalized people, oppression of the feminine. And I don't mean that in a gendered way. I think a person of any gender embodies the feminine. And certainly it's a word that more and more people have reclaimed and embodied as we have started to revalue feminine power again. And so it's also political to me and a big part of my identity in the world, as much as it's a big part of my spiritual practice and my paganism too.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. I think that distinction between feminine, not as specifically belonging to gender, is so important as something that we all can express, kind of like what you were saying, Gwendolyn, about, the witch can be in all of us. So I want to keep in mind tonight that our audience is mostly writers, and in particular horror authors. So I definitely want us to get into how witches are represented in fiction and in film, but I do know that the word witch can be confusing for some people, particularly because it can mean a lot of different things. And I know the expression I can get sometimes when I say that I'm a witch is very similar to the expression I get when I say I'm a horror author. And, I want to, I think it's also further challenging because of the blurred lines between fictional and real witches. And I want to have us talk about what that word means to you, and just to try to demystify the word witch a little bit more for our audience. So, Zoraida. would you like to start us off? So what is it like when you use that word, what are you referring to? Like, how do we, what are some of the ways that we can demystify, even though it's such a mystical archetype? I don't know if we can really do that, but
it is, it's because it's so ingrained with very specific connotations. I know that when I was a younger, I would have said like, what's a witch? And my mind would immediately go to Salem, right? And would go to witch burnings and hangings and things like that. And in Europe when there were all of the witch scares. But growing up in a very specific household, I think it also just means it does have feminine connotations. So to me, it means nature, and it means healing, and it means community. Even though there are, there's this idea of the solitary witch, I think that for the generation that we're part of, and the generation that is coming up now, I do think that there is more, even if you're by yourself, like we're all alone, like we're all in quarantine, right? I hope. And so this just means that our connections are now on the internet. I just remember it makes me think of this episode from Buffy when they meet the neo pagan with Jenny Calendar in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. You know what I'm talking about? And she's like telling them like witchcraft is modernizing, and I think that that's just an evolution that's part of it. But yeah, to me it's just like nature, community, the femininity. But the most important part for me and for my books is the community aspect.
Yeah. And Gwendolyn?
I liked what you said about healing. I think witches are often healers. And what's so sad about that is that they've kind of always historically been healers. They were often midwives and things like that. And they were, they were the person that people would go to really, help them. And yet at the same time, they were maligned. And it's very sad when you think about it that way, of like, they were the person that, this is who we need to help us. But at the same time, this is also a person, you're going to be angry at, we're going to take things out on. So I think healing is a big part of witchcraft. It doesn't have to be, obviously, but I think, even with the sense of community, I think often we look for community as a place of healing and as a place that we can come together and we feel less alone. And so I think that I do really like that idea of witchcraft now being even more of a sense of community. And often historically, witches couldn't have as big of a community. Covens were often small because you couldn't have huge gatherings because you were so maligned and it was dangerous. So it is wonderful to be in a time period that I don't feel like we've ever really had historically, that so many people can go to one another and be public about this and not fear, and obviously that's not true in every part of the world, but certainly I feel like the parts of the world that we're, the part of the world that we're in, you can be a witch and you can be fairly open about it and not fear, being burned or being stoned. So I think that community is probably something witches have always wanted. That's why, covens are so associated with that, but we can have that so much more now. And I think that to me is a huge part of it. So really healing, and I like community. Both of those are such huge parts of witchcraft, at least, the way I see it.
Yeah. And Pam?
Yeah, like I find it most useful for myself to talk about witches as archetypal beings because it does confuse people. There are historical people who other people identified as witches, usually as a negative epithet, often because of sexism or xenophobia. On the other hand, there was a movement that many people are aware of in the 20th century, kind of like a pagan revivalist movement, and the religion of Wicca was grown up out of that. So there are people who now identify as witches, and they're talking about it in relation to kind of that history. And then there's all the folklore and all of the literature and the art and our idea of these magical beings, usually women, who could shapeshift, and they could change the weather, and they would have charms and potions and spells and all of this. So it does get confusing for people. And the fact and the fiction of witches are constantly informing each other. And so that's why, to me, talking about witches as archetypes or an archetype is really, really useful. And what attracts me so much to the archetype of the witch is that it's often about unruly, self-directed feminine beings who have power on their own terms. So, they're not, they don't have power in relation to other people. We witches are often fond of saying there's no Pope of witchcraft. There's no one book you have to read. The power's around you. It's in nature. It's imminent. It's in you. And because of that, a lot of people find it really threatening. But I think that is such a beautiful aspect of the archetype, and something that I think more and more feminists of all genders really gravitate towards about that archetype too. It is self-directed and autonomous and individual, as it is also communal. And I think that balance is really delicious.
Mm-hmm. And Alexis.
Yeah, I agree with everything that everyone has said so far. For me, I think that witches have always represented figures of rebellion or liberation, and more specifically, the idea that someone, man, woman, they, otherwise, like anyone, any person could free themselves. And so this kind of freedom that is turned inward is something that I've always kind of associated with witches and witchcraft. And I think it is something that crosses over from the idea of the witch as like an archetype to the witches that I know in real life. And that's what attracted me to the practice. And it's something that, that I deeply associate with witchcraft. And I think it also plays into sort of like the political significance of the witch as an idea, this kind of freedom from convention, freedom from the binary, freedom from this sort of idea of darkness and light, right and wrong, and the sort of exchange between what many people consider to be extremes. That's something that I associate with the idea of the witch, or the word witch. And it's something that I think I find a lot of comfort in, and I'm kind of fascinated by this idea because I think it is so subversive in the sense that that is something that society doesn't really reinforce.
Yeah, and so all of you have kind of touched on this in a way already. This idea that like Gwendolyn said, in some parts of the world, it's still actually literally unsafe to be a witch, but here where we are, it is technically safe. We can speak about it publicly. So many people are reclaiming the word, as you said. At the same time, that stigma isn't all the way gone, so there can be this it's taken me a long time. Part of it could be just as society has changed, but also just because even within my own family, it can be something I don't want to talk about because it brings up conversations that I just don't want to have. But so how have you reckoned with the notion of being a witch in the public eye? And do you ever resist saying that publicly? Is there a part of you that fears, I don't know, that you won't be taken as seriously? Or how are you all thinking about being a witch in the public eye at this time? And Alexis, I'll start with you. Okay.
This is such an interesting question for me because being a debut, I'm just trying to figure out how to exist in the public eye, period. This is all very new for me. And it's strange when parts of your person almost become like a form of entertainment or something that you present or even perform to the world. So I think that kind of goes for all aspects of my personality person. But as for my practice and my spiritual journey and how I identify myself, that's been a particular challenge because it sort of feels like I'm trying to figure out who and what I am while presenting it to the world as a concrete, when really my person and my practice is evolving, and the process of figuring out how to demonstrate that in a way that feels honest but doesn't sort of compromise my my own process it's been interesting, to say the least. I'm kind of interested to hear what other people who maybe have more experience in this department have to say, because as a debut who's very new to this whole publishing and public eye thing, it's been maybe one of the bigger challenges for me just so far. Yeah.
Oh, Gwendolyn.
I actually love what Alexis just said, because I almost feel like in general, it's not normal to live in the public eye. And as writers, we do. And it's interesting because we're not at the level of, say, like Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt. So it's not to this terrifying level, right? Where it's like people are going to bother us on the street for the most part. But it's still at this level that you are presenting yourself to the world. And no matter how much we want that to be authentic, we are still always cherry picking what we're saying. And that's partially to guard ourselves, and partially because, you know, if we're talking about, you know, a book that we wrote about witchcraft, you know, I have, several of us have, yeah, all of us have. And so it's like, you know, you want to talk about that. It's relevant, but at the same time, like, how much do you give up of yourself? You know, how much of it, you don't want it to feel performative. Even though really in some ways, anytime you have to engage with the public, there's a little bit of performance involved. No matter how genuine you want to be, that's always going to be part of it. So I like what Alexis said, because I feel like that's presenting how you are, you know, your witchcraft and your practice is kind of in many ways like presenting yourself as an author, and like, who are we? You know, what do we want to give away about ourselves? What do we want to keep for ourselves? And you know, like, one of the things with my witchcraft is I don't usually ever put out pictures of my altar. I don't really care if someday I do, if there's some reason I want to. It's not like I'm like, no, never. But as of right now, it just feels to me that's mine. That's something, you know, it was, you know, an altar that my husband and I bought together, and it's everything on it. You know, my husband actually does pottery and clay, so he's made many of the pieces. They're original to us, and it's not that I don't want to share those. It's just at the same time, it's ours, and it's something that we have. So it's like, I'm always kind of like, will I share it someday? Maybe. I mean, maybe at some point something will come up and I'll be like, heck yeah, I'm going to share this today. But, you know, there is some guarding of that and wanting to say some of this is mine and some of this, you know, is ours. So it can be hard. It's a hard thing to navigate. I think the way we all live in the public eye is hard to navigate anyways. You know, I feel like as authors, but then even, you know, people who aren't authors, and we're all living in the public eye now. And it's strange sometimes. I feel like we haven't had enough time to adapt to how different things are from 10 or 15 years ago, different from even how many of us grew up. So it's, yeah, that's just a constant evolution, I feel like, for all of us, or at least for me.
Zoraida?
You know, it's weird because, so I published my first book in 2012, and I feel like I don't really take myself too seriously when I talk about my own personal life, because at the end of the day, like, it shouldn't matter, right? It shouldn't matter for the most part, you know, like, what my day-to-day is. And I think it matters who I am as a person, right? Because you don't want to buy books by terrible people. So I always try to do my best to reflect the things that I believe in. I went on a podcast called That Witch Life a couple of months ago. I think it was during the summer. Time means nothing in 2020. And I told them that I fluctuate between being like, I'm an atheist, to being like, I'm a pagan. But even when I think that I'm an atheist, I still travel with my altar and with my my remnants of Catholicism, right? Like, the Virgin Mary is always going to be one of my favorite figures, because she's my favorite part of, you know, the culture, my cultural religion that I was born into, right? And had no choice but to be part of. And so I think that I've created my own sort of religion, but nobody really asks me to talk about. And I think that is a different kind of privilege than, say, like, a Muslim author who always has to talk about their religion when they're writing something, right? And so it's, you know, I do know that I'll get funny looks. You know, people always think I'm joking when I'm just like, I put Poseidon as like my new patron saint, and I'm not joking, right? But I'm okay with that. Like, I feel like over the years I've grown okay with people thinking I'm a little weird or strange, as long as they buy my books and like read my books, right? That's fine with me. But I do think because religion is such a personal thing that, you know, I shouldn't have to like tell you everything, that how I'm feeling today, how I'm practicing this month. But it's still something that I hold very dear to my heart. And a matter of self-reflection as a writer specifically, because I know so many authors who like thank their own personal deity in their author acknowledgments, and I'm like, I don't do that. Should I do that? And so I go through these moments, these fluctuations of like, what do I put out there versus what I keep personal. And I love what Gwendolyn said about not taking pictures of her altar, because I carry I'll carry stones with me, but I'm not going to post a picture of like, here are all my ancestors, or like here's like my great grandmother, here's a picture, like I don't necessarily want to put that out there. But I do like to share, because there's a wall that is so thin between author and reader now. And it almost feels like people want personalities sometimes instead of just books. They want the book and the personality. And sometimes it's a little scary, but other times it's like, oh wow, like I get to share a very intimate part of myself with, Instagram.
Pam?
I think for me, it's been such an interesting journey because I was doing all my witch life stuff in this bifurcated way for many years, where I had a day job. I worked for corporate America. I worked for Getty Images for 14 years, and my job became more and more public facing, strangely and surprisingly to me, the longer I was there. And so I never hid from my coworkers that I was a witch, and everyone who knew me knew I was interested in this, and knew of my blog, or events or workshops that I was teaching, or art shows I was curating about the occult or witchcraft or whatever. So it's not like it was hidden, but because I had this day job and there's human resources at the day job, you just don't talk about religion or spirituality with your coworkers in general. And so in some ways it kind of protected me from having to navigate this. But the longer I was there, the more I felt a little bit like, instead of being integrated, I felt a little bifurcated. And some of that's also just about my journey as, my purpose here and the kind of work I want to be doing. And when I left Getty Images, I wrote my book, my podcast came out, I was suddenly thrust in a more public position, like, hey, everybody, I'm a witch. And because my book is nonfiction and I'm exploring the archetype of the witch in the book, but there is a through line of me identifying as a witch, I think my readers definitely expect and know me to talk about myself and my witchcraft and my journey with witchcraft. And it is sometimes weird, and it is sometimes I try not to dwell in this space too much because I don't want to attract it, but you can get weirdos who say threatening, shitty things to you. I mean, look, being a lady on the internet, you could get that anyway. But if you're calling yourself a witch, or you represent anything that goes against the patriarchy, like, that can make people say scary things to you on occasion on the internet. And so I'm definitely protective of, where I live and my family and just certain private things that I imagine we all are, because we're interfacing with our readers more publicly. But because it is that frisson of the word witch, I do have this extra, we have protective spells and amulets all over the place too. But I also think it's important to not let that fear cause us to hide. I think the more of us who use that word proudly makes it a little bit more safe, or at least will embolden other people to be proud about who they are in their witchery as well. So that feels important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and all of you have talked a bit about how witches have always had both a place in history, and they've been a topic of fascination in pop culture for a long time, but it seems like there is this boom of curiosity and fascination and people being more public about it. And maybe it's just the corner of Instagram that I find myself on, but I'm just curious, with this rise of the popularity of both the witch as an archetype, as a practice, and even just as an aesthetic, why do you think that the witch can still be scary in fiction? And Pam, I'll stick with you.
Yeah, I mean, something I think about a lot is that witches reflect our fears and our fantasies about feminine power. And as much as I want to be like out in these streets being like, no, witches are all lovely and we're all awesome and we're channels of love, and that is how I conduct myself as much as possible, I still think that the archetype is so deeply rooted in fear of feminine power, fear of aging. I mean, like, think of all the things about witches that we still associate with that archetype. Either they're old and ugly and powerful, or they're sexy and seductive and therefore scary, or they want to kill babies, or like there's all this stuff. They have all this control. So I just think it taps really deeply into, again, these anti-patriarchal notions that I find really exciting and important to delve into and to explore, and to have fun with as well. But I don't think that witches are ever going to stop being scary. I don't even know that they should. But I like that the archetype is expanding to be a full spectrum of all the complexity of what feminine power means. And that's why it is endlessly fascinating to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Zoraida?
I think that witches will probably always be a little bit scary to a greater society. It's not just Instagram aesthetics, right? It's not just a bunch of people all of a sudden buying like crystals on Amazon and being like, I'm a witch now, which is fine. You like your practice is your practice, like whatever. But I think that it's what Pam said, right? It's a fear of very specific things, and I think it's fear of the matriarchy, and it is fear of the other. So I'm speaking specifically about young adult fiction, right? But in young adult fiction, in media directed towards teens like Buffy, supernatural creatures were always gonna, like, one of the ways to read them was always going to be to symbolize the other. But you still had white people as the other. Werewolves, witches. There was like a Buffy Fish episode, and I'm just gonna go back to it because I just did a rewatch. Supernatural, same thing, right? And as much as I love those things, it only showcases the other in a certain way. But now, what is happening when like non-white authors, people of color, are writing witches? Does the metaphor still hold up? And is it scary to have people of color in power? Yes, right? And I think it's always going to be, specifically for an American society at this point in time, I think that that's not something that I was thinking about when I was writing the Brooklyn Brujas series. In the very beginning, I was thinking about the power of a young girl, the power of family, the power of what it means to get rid of your ancestral connections. And so now writing witches again for future projects, it's the idea of xenophobia and not wanting to have a certain kind of people in your neighborhood or in your country. And so I think that if witchcraft remains that metaphor, or can be like still applies to that metaphor, then yeah, witchcraft is going to be scary. I don't think that witches are going to be scary in like the Wicked Witch of the West or the East, kind of way. Like they're never going to be green again. I think that they're going to be that Angelina Jolie, Maleficent kind of witch, right? I think that's what we've seen in the TV shows that have been coming up. The Craft reboot, all of the girls are still pretty and young, and they still use the exact same imagery that they have used for the last 30 years. So, but those girls are not scary. I think it's scary how much power they have, but they're enticing. And I think like anytime women are powerful and enticing and in possession of themselves, I think that in itself is scary to a wider audience.
Yeah. Alexis?
Yeah, I totally agree. So when I was writing my book, The Year of the Witching, the witches sort of presented themselves to me in this kind of pretty horrific way, which wasn't surprising to me because the whole world, all sides of it, are dark and scary. I wrote, a dark fantasy horror-ish novel. But what I came to realize was the reason that I was afraid of the witches was very different than the reason I was afraid of the system that kind of exists opposite to them, which is this church theocracy helmed by this horrible prophet. The reason I was scared of the witches was because I was sort of scared of myself and my own capabilities and the repercussions of me sort of coming into my own power or denying myself that power, and all of the complicated feelings that I had about that I channeled into this idea of the witches in my book, and that they terrified me. And I think the complication of that and everything that they represented to me, and the fact that really they were kind of a reflection of my own struggle or maybe even some innate darkness within myself, kind of forcing me to see that through my own creation and reckon with it. That's what made me fear them on a personal level. And I think that a lot of people are sort of either drawn or repulsed to the idea of the witch for similar reasons. I'm on TikTok, which is the app TikTok. I'm really hooked on it. And I watch, as like kids much younger than me are kind of exploring witch talk, which is like, I guess like the Wicca witch section of TikTok. And it's interesting to me the way that I see the very sort of same exchange or struggle that I sort of experienced while I was writing my book, where people are sort of in equal parts drawn to and afraid of this idea of the witch. And I think that the fear and the draw are kind of oftentimes the same force, that it's people sort of working with what's inside of them and looking at themselves and then becoming afraid of it. And the witch is sort of a projection or a place to project those fears. So that's why I think I was afraid of witches, and why I think people may continue to be afraid of them, whether or not that's warranted. But I think it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. And Gwendolyn?
I love that, Alexis, because I actually think, for me as a woman, as women, we've never been given power. No one's ever going to give us power. And now that we're finally claiming our power, one of the things I always struggle with is how can you have power without oppressing someone else with it? Because that's the nature of power. And that's something that's always frightened me about power, is that it corrupts you so easily, so quickly. And, there's not a good roadmap, because historically the people who have had power have always hurt others with it. So it's not like there's like this way in society that it's like, oh, this one civilization somewhere did it really well, and there wasn't a bunch of xenophobia or misogyny or racism. It's been across all cultures through all time. So all power has always been misused. And something that I'm always thinking about, as a witch and as a writer, how can we use power in a way that is empowering to not just ourselves? And with witchcraft, with the community, I feel like you can really, share that power. But even then, who are you sharing it with? Are you sharing it with everyone? Are you choosing certain people? And then is it still oppressing somebody else? So that's definitely a place that, I, as a witch, am always thinking about and really reckoning with that. And when I was writing my last book, Boneset and Feathers, that was something that was really all about what she was dealing with. The main character, Odette, she gave up witchcraft. When we come into the book, she's given it up completely. Witchfinders had come through, they'd killed a bunch of witches. She felt like, I can't be a witch. This is too dangerous for everyone around me. She also mistrusted herself with it. And the whole book is really her learning how to deal with those feelings and saying, how can I claim this power without hurting others with it, because I said there isn't a roadmap. We don't have a roadmap of how to share power in a way that doesn't corrupt us or corrupt something or create an oppressive system. So it is something I genuinely think, because I'm always really hopeful and really optimistic, even when there's sometimes no reason to be. But I think that where we're at now as a society, where so many more people have a voice and so many more people are being listened to, I feel like we're at a place that maybe we can finally start reckoning with power and not having it just be oppressive to others. That's my hope. You know, I'm hoping that's the direction we're heading. So fingers crossed.
Yeah, I feel like we're always in this juxtaposition. So as a real life witch, I feel like I want to reassure people that witches are not scary. They don't do bad things. They're not going to curse you. At least I'm not. Things like that. And then at the same time, we've talked a lot about how the witch can be a really potent figure when used in a horror story, for example. And so I'm wondering if, how as horror authors, or if we're contemplating writing a horror story, how do we straddle that line between dismantling the stereotype and also telling a good, creepy story? And also off the back of that, what are some ways we could use the horror genre to subvert some of those more damaging tropes? Alexis.
So for me, I think I kind of wanted to approach my witches not just as witches, but as people. And people are complicated and messy, and they can be dark. People can be they're capable of great evil, and they're capable of, they have the capacity to do really good things and really wonderful things. And I think that when I was writing my story as a horror author, of course, I'm focused on kind of the darker parts of humanity in general, but I wanted to make sure that I had a balanced approach when writing my story, so that the witches aren't like the big evil of my world. And I think even though my world is a second world fantasy, I think that I have a responsibility as an author to portray people who have been marginalized in many different ways, whether it's for their faith or their race, in a way that is accurate. So that was something I kept at the forefront of my mind. Part of that was research. I was like giving advice to any author who wants to kind of write about witchcraft. It's, don't write about things that are closed practices. Especially if that's not your practice. I think you have to be careful when you're representing people's beliefs and kind of portraying them in fiction. People will say, take what you write as fact sometimes. And I think that in light of that, we do have a responsibility to make sure that we're portraying witches in an accurate light. And it's sometimes a narrow line to walk. But for me, I think it's kind of like looking at humans as humans before I look at them as sort of archetypes or symbols. And so that was kind of at the heart of my story while I was working through my portrayal of the witches.
Gwendolyn?
I think I really, again, I like what Alexis said, especially if you're writing outside of, you can do so much with witches, it's very general, but if you're going to do something really specific of somebody's, practice, be really careful of that, because that often goes very awry. If it's not your practice, I've seen a lot. I mean, if you're a horror writer and you're a horror reader, you've seen a lot of things with voodoo that are very offensive. Let's just call it what it is. It's offensive, and I feel like everybody should have always known it was offensive, but hopefully we're learning. Again, I'm an optimist, and I think maybe we're learning that that's, no, don't do that. So in particular, I would say anything like that, be very careful of that, because, you don't want to do that. There's enough you can do with witches, that are very general, and just go in that direction, I would say, before, because Alexis is right. People will take it as fact, even if it's fiction. Like, they'll take it as, okay, this part of it is accurate. So yeah, that can go awry very easily. So that's definitely one place I would not advise people to go to. For me, when I'm thinking about writing horror with witches, first place I go to is kind of the existential dread of living in a world that wants to, keep out anybody who's different. So for me, that's where the horror always is. And most of my work, you know, it's how cruel people can be to anyone who's different. And so that's a very natural place where you can kind of go in a horror direction. If you do want to make a scary witch in your work, then, you know, I think that can still work. I'm not completely against that. Again, I would say the main thing is don't go down a route, you know, like we were saying, don't take somebody else's culture, because then it's like you're making it like that culture is bad, and don't do that. Like, please, just if you get anything out of this, anything out of what I say tonight, please just don't do that, you know. But if you do want to have a scary witch, a lot of people love the movie The Witch. I had my problems with it. I love Black Phillip. I always say, like, I'm big team Black Phillip, but like I had a problem with the fact that it was a very kind of stereotypical depiction of a witch that really isn't really historically accurate. But lots of people love it. So I mean, you know, a lot of people, I'm overruled in that regard. So it's all right. You know, you can still have scary witches. None of the real witches are going to show up at your door and yell at you for it, you know, but we might not read it. So just can consider that, I guess. So yeah, and I would say just remember there are people out there who are actually witches. So, you know, just I like, again, like what Alexis said, to come at it as them being real people. And I feel like from there, you know, allow them that complexity. And I think yeah, that's all good.
Zoraida?
So something that Gwendolyn said struck me, because I agree with you know, writing things respectfully, especially when they're not in your culture. When I started writing Labyrinth Lost, which was the first book in the Brooklyn Brujas series, I did anti-research, right? So I set off to create a witch system for my books specifically. And so I read about like Santeria and different practices that are typically associated with Latin American people, because I think that when you have a Black woman, an Indian woman, like a Native woman, or a Latinx person on screen as a witch, they tend to be like stereotypical. They tend to have, like, you know, ropes of corny shells and like incense and like no matter what race they are, they always have dreads. And so I think that like that's supposed to be seen as scary. And when what that really says is like you're just telling us what you actually think of these people in this culture. And so when I was doing my anti-research, I was just making sure that I didn't put like specifically Santero practices into Labyrinth Lost, because like you don't want to invoke something that isn't yours on the page, right? Like you can't copy and paste an enchantment or a ritual into your fiction. I don't think that's right. And I think that that's your writer muscle, right? How, as a writer, do you create a new kind of witch? That is what I set out to do when I started writing Labyrinth Lost. And even though it's in, like, I have an author's note that says like, I made up this religion, I still get comments that always like tell me like, thank you for teaching me about like Latin American witchcraft. And I'm like, but it isn't, but thanks for thinking it is. And so that becomes another complicated area when you create something, because I feel like there is this misconception that just because it's in fiction, it means it came from somewhere. That is true for a lot of things, right? Like Percy Jackson comes from Greek mythology. J.K. Rowling, you know, She Who Must Not Be Named, her creatures, you know, she didn't create a boggart. She just pulled it out of the pages of British folk tales, right? So like she created her, you know, like the Latin based charms, but we just have to be careful of what we think is like our creation versus what already existed. And I think that is our job as authors, to make something new. And I think that, I don't even know if this is the question, but the more that I write magical people, you know, I my new series, which is called The Hollow Crown, it's a duology. I created magical people. I don't call them witches, but they're based off of the Spanish Inquisition, right? When we like persecuted an entire groups of people, the Spanish, you know, to convert to Catholicism. What does that look like, right? You know, they have powers. What does it look like when we create magic that is supposed to symbolize something else? And like, what is our job as authors to do our due diligence for the people that we're writing, for our readers, and for our inspiration.
Yeah. And Pam?
Yeah, piggybacking off of that, I also think I would love to see the archetype of the witch get away from like just a lot of the negative things that we have said about women for so long. And I'm using that word broadly because so much of our notion of what witches are, the negative notion of that, comes from a very specific male kind of point of view, generally speaking, a Christian one that, you know, really was afraid of sexuality and afraid of feminine power and afraid of nature and all of this stuff. And there's a lot of richness there that can be unpacked. But I do see a lot of people who lean on like, oh, you know, and I'm not familiar with every single one of all of your books. So I'm also like, oh, don't accidentally insult anyone's characters. But like, I often see witches that are motivated by like, they really want to be beautiful. And I think that can be interesting if you do something new and complicated with it. But with a very light touch, it kind of just reinforces stereotypes about women, and all we give a fuck about is being pretty, right? So I would just say, if we can, just like we want more complicated women, and they can be villains, they can be protagonists, but have to be well-rounded and have motivation and, you know, historical context and societal context. So too, I would love that lens to be put upon any witch that we create. So it's not just these two-dimensional stereotypes that keep reinforcing all of these just tired old tropes, you know, things that we say about women that, you know, we're catty, that we can't get along, you know, all of that tired stuff. I'm always excited when I see a witch who has more going on than just that.
Definitely. And wow, I feel like I could keep asking you all questions all night, but this hour flew by, and I do want to answer a few of the audience questions. So we have one from Samantha that actually I think attaches to what we were just talking about pretty well, or kind of is a good follow-up to that. It says, being witches, do you feel an aversion to writing truly evil witch characters out of fear of misrepresenting fellow real-life witches? So we kind of talked about that a little bit, but I like that aversion part of like writing a truly evil witch. Does anybody want to address that one?
There is one character, this is a tiny bit of a spoiler, but there is one character in my current novel that is a witch, and she's pretty bad. She is, but I try to kind of give the audience some understanding of what made her that way, of what really turned her so kind of sour against the world. And a lot of it has to do with, you know, the persecution and you know, the witch finders and the witch hunts. And so I felt like, you know, I'm not totally averse to making witches evil, but if I do, again, going back to this idea of don't just make them evil. I mean, that's kind of boring anyways, even just if you're not trying to like, you know, make it more complex for the sake of the, you know, dismantling this trope. It's just more interesting if you have more of an idea. What would make someone be that evil? What would make someone kind of go in that direction, and exploring that, so that way it's not just like, oh, she's a witch and she's a woman, so she's obviously evil. Like, you really do want to unpack it a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that the older I get, the more I sympathize with the witches in Disney movies, right? Like my favorite movie was The Little Mermaid, and I watched it so much when I was in Ecuador that I'm pretty sure like this is how I learned how to speak English. But then, now I'm just like Ursula was wronged. Like King Triton definitely screwed her over, right? And that's why she's like this. And so I think that my job as an author is to give my villains as much emotional depth as my heroes have. And as a writer, this has been a very, very long journey because part of me has always been like, well, the story is about the good guy and the bad guy is just sort of there, but it shouldn't be that way. And I think that like now I'm more interested in writing complicated villains and complicated people who do bad things. I'm not afraid to write a witch that does bad things, but I also am not afraid to write about people who do bad things, because I think that the area where this does get dicey and kind of and complicated and problematic is when your only person of color is the witch that's bad, right? Or I forgot what movie I saw, but it was like Samuel L. Jackson was like the boogeyman, and like scaring all of these like little white kids, and I was like, he's not white in the books. Like this is not how you get diversity into something. So like that's where I have a problem. But I don't have a problem with writing somebody who does bad things, as long as like it's complicated and fun, and maybe we root for the villain instead of the hero, right? I've always been like a Captain America girl, and then as soon as Captain America like went rogue, I was like, ooh, I like you 10 million times more now, right? So like there's something really interesting about those kinds of characters.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. My husband loves professional wrestling, and we're also a big Star Wars family. We were all talking about Star Wars offline before this started. And because I've watched now so much Star Wars, which I love as well, and so much professional wrestling, which I like some of, it's really interesting, the notion of like in wrestling, they call it the baby face and the heel. And a lot of times a good guy wrestler will go bad and the audience like loves them even more, right? And when you think about Star Wars, if you think about a character like a Kylo Ren, he's really freaking complicated. And the fact that they do try to make him sympathetic and complex, to everyone's point, like just makes him, I think, all the richer. And so too, I would love to see that with more witches. I get tired when the only witch in a character is just really flat and two-dimensional and just like this easy little Dungeons and Dragons device bad guy or bad gal. So, I think we're all saying the same thing, which is just like put as much heart and thought and motivation into your witches as you do into all of your other characters.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what everyone said, and I think that when it comes to approaching evil witches or really any evil character, but especially evil witches, I first asked myself, well, what do I know to be evil, and who told me that, and why? Why do I believe this thing to be evil? And so I think starting there is like a good place to sort of question yourself and maybe challenge these ideas of like villains and heroes and good and evil, and create portrayals of characters that are a little bit more complex. So
Definitely. Well, we have a question from Gabby. She says, do you ever get told your witchy novels aren't really horror or horror enough? And what do you say to that? And then if you have never been told that, what would you say to that?
I don't think I've ever been told that. I thought that I was writing with Labyrinth Laws and the subsequent books. I thought I was just writing like sisters have adventures. And then my readers are like, this book is so scary. And I'm like, is it? And then they're like, yeah, she raises the dead in book 2. And like, there's like so many dead people. And I'm like, oh, you're right. But I was just thinking about like the fun parts in Coney Island. So I think that I just, in my mind, I don't write scary, but my readers seem to think differently. And I think that's just like a personal perception.
Yeah. Yeah. Alexis.
I'm sorry. I was
Oh, I thought you were
thinking
raising your hand. I was like, yeah, go ahead.
ahead.
Does anyone else have anything they wanted to add to that?
I overall, like maybe not specifically witch stories, but there have every once in a while, a couple people will say that something of mine isn't horror enough. And oftentimes it is because it's about the horror of being female or of the feminine.
Mm.
And somebody will be like, oh, but this isn't scary to me. And it's almost invariably a dude. And so I'm like, yeah, it wouldn't be scary to you, would it? That doesn't happen a lot. It definitely has happened before to me, and I'm always just like, yeah. And I don't ever respond to it directly. I don't see any value in that at all.
Right.
But
it's like,
yeah. But it's for me, it's just. I always say people have different perceptions. Like you were saying, you didn't even think your book was scary, so it's like whatever people consider it. I'm just like, you do you. It's none of my business.
Same.
I do think like
on this. Oh, sorry.
no. I was gonna say like it's like how men are just like they will never understand that fear of like walking down the block to your apartment with like your keys in your hands, like between your knuckles, and they're just like, why do you do that? I'm like, in case somebody attacks me, like, you know, it's like that's like a personal fear, and they'll never understand that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that horror is so specific to different people, and I had a similar experience. I didn't start out wanting or necessarily thinking I was writing horror. I just kind of wrote the book, and I let people make of it what they will. So yeah, I think a lot of being an author is writing something and then letting other people tell you what they think it is or their best guess, and then just kind of rolling with that. So that's been my experience.
Anything to add, Pam?
I mean, I was just thinking, because I'm not a horror writer, I consulted on the new the reboot of The Craft, and I know that there's a lot of conversation about the first film was like super scary and the reboot wasn't as scary, and I did not write the script, so but I was hired by them, so I can't fully comment on it. But I don't know, I feel like fear is so subjective, and obviously that's what horror traffics in. So as long as you are working with some component of fear, I think it counts as horror, or can. And the genre is so elastic, and there's certain kinds of horror that I love and certain kinds of horror that are just like not for me. And so if somebody is looking for really gory, gruesome horror, maybe they're not gonna like, I mean, that there can be very gruesome witches, of course, as we know, but okay, so maybe a certain book might not be for them, or a certain film might not be for them. But if it's trafficking in fear, then I think that's what makes it horror, as easy as that.
And we have one final question that I would love to get to, and there were a few more, and I apologize to everyone that we couldn't get to all your questions. We'll just have to do a part 2 one day. But I would love if I could ask this question and then we'll get some quick answers, because I think this would be a nice one to wrap up with. So Mary asks, what's your advice for someone who wants to embody the witch, is doing research, exploring it in their creativity, but taking ownership feels like imposter syndrome and intimidating? Does anyone want to?
Yeah, I can speak to that, because I get asked that question a lot, especially from people who listen to my podcast. A lot of people who listen, a lot of them are seasoned or they're witch adjacent, but there are lots of people who are just starting out, and there are so many other witchcraft podcasts that people are excited to listen to because it's their often first foray or early foray into learning about this world. And witch is a word that it is so charged with intuition. If it's a word that is calling you in terms of identifying as that word, like there's no permission slip that you need. You don't get a witch certificate. Like, yes, you can find like online courses. Yes, there are different initiatory paths. But the beauty of witchcraft is that it is very self-directed, and like everyone's path is really different, and it's often led, I often say follow the trail of cosmic breadcrumbs. And what I mean by that is a lot of us who have come to identify as witches, it's like, well, first we read this book, and then this thing in this movie kind of resonated, and then we met this person, and like it's very, very individual. And so I think you'll know when you are ready to claim that word for yourself. And it can always be private. You don't have to be out here telling everyone you're a witch if you never want to. Like, don't feel pressure. But if it is a word that makes you feel powerful and beautiful and capable and helps you claim your place in this world, then it's a word that belongs to you, as far as I'm concerned.
That was so beautifully said. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, I very much agree. I feel like it, like you said, there's no permission slip for it. I do think sometimes people are like, well, I'm not a witch because I haven't studied enough. But everybody has to start somewhere. So just if that, like you said, if that word's calling out to you, just go for it. Take ownership of it and have fun. Witchcraft can be really fun. I feel like that's something that sometimes gets lost. It can be so much fun. If you're having fun with it, then you're a witch. That's enough.
Yeah, and I think it's like, I think the most important thing to ask is like, is it personal to you? Everything that Pam said, is it personal to you? And are you respecting, because I feel like with religion, we have like or with witchcraft specifically, we have a tendency like we're going to pull from all these different practices, and we just have to be respectful about like where something comes from, right? Is it indigenous? Is it Black American? Is it Caribbean? Is it, where does it come from? And I think that like living with intention is so important. And it's even more important when you go into something like this.
Yeah, definitely. And then just somebody commented that you could easily have asked the question, additionally, how can you call yourself a writer without the imposter syndrome? So the question works with that as well.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you all so much. This has been lovely. I feel like we could keep talking for hours, but we have to wrap it up. And I'll hand it back over to Kathryn McGee.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you all. If any of you joined late, this has been Skeleton Hour. We do this every month. It's the Horror Writers Association's monthly horror literature webinar series. So we'll be announcing next month's event shortly on social media. So please look forward to that. And thank you all so much for being on the panel. This was an amazing discussion. And thanks to everyone who's watching. And I also just want to briefly introduce John Palisano, who's the president of HWA.
Hi, everybody. What an amazing panel. And I just really thank you from the bottom of my heart for sharing your time and expertise and passion with everybody. What an amazing panel. And thank you again. Just terrific. And what Kathryn said. So amazing. All right.
Nice.
So thanks again. And we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.